And coming up shortly on our Impact Minds panel, we'll be discussing the Amazon rainforest. Who decides its value and how it should be used or protected? There were 74,000 fires in the Brazilian Amazon between January and August this year. That's according to the country's own official figures. But Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro this week told the UN General Assembly that the Amazon rainforest wasn't being devastated by fires, as it was being reported by what he called the lying media. He was responding to worldwide concern over what's happening to the rainforest, more than half of which falls within Brazilian borders. Mr. Bolsonaro says it's not the world's business. He said those painting this as a global problem are colonialists, insulting Brazil's sovereignty.
It's a fallacy to say that the Amazon is part of world heritage, and wrong to say, as scientists affirm, that our rainforests are the lungs of the world.
Well, does Brazil's president have a point? Who decides the value of the Amazon and how it should be used or pay for it to be protected? Joining me now to discuss this is Angela Terry from the Climate Alliance and Meg Trethewey from the Conservative Environment Network, described as a forum for conservatives who support conservation. And from Washington, we have Shweta Chakraborty, who's an environmentalist and behavioural scientist. Shweta, thank you for joining our debate today. I want to ask you all first, Angela first, does Mr. Bolsonaro have a point? It is Brazilian land.
So what he's trying to say is look away, there's nothing to see here, and it's not true that the Amazon's on fire. We have very good satellite data now that means you can't try and greenwash over a problem of this scale. The forest fires are more than double what they were last year. So there is a real issue, a real concern. And the key reason, apart from the local air pollution and all the damage to the wildlife that's happening in the Amazon, is that it's releasing more and more carbon into the atmosphere, and that is an international problem that he can't escape just by using words.
Shweta, let's bring you in from Washington. How much of a point do you think Mr. Bolsonaro might have when he says this is a sovereign issue?
This is by no means unilateral decision-making, because the decisions made by any nation-state leaders about shared resources globally are impacting everyone around the world, especially when it's a critical land system like the Amazon. Similarly, the Congo Basin is equally responsible for cooling and keeping the planet habitable. So to claim that this is a sovereign issue is irresponsible at best and may actually be worth bringing to the International Crime Court because of the impacts it has on ecocide.
Meg, do you think his point should be entirely ignored, or do you think there's something in what Mr. Bolsonaro is saying?
I think climate change is certainly an international issue, and the responses we've seen in Paris and hopefully in Glasgow next year will certainly be an international response, and that's really important. But the main concern for me is why Brazil doesn't see this as their own issue. Why is he not seeing the severity of the issue with regards to climate change, and why is it not more of a priority for him for tackling it? And potentially taking a more positive approach towards that and to convince him of that is more effective than potentially trying to force an international community's wills on a sovereign country.
You know, at this point, I think we have a tweet from somebody in Brazil, because I tweeted earlier today to say, you know, what do people around the world think about this? If we can bring up a tweet, I think we have from a viewer in Brazil talking about the Amazon. I think we have a tweet there just coming through. And saying that it is an issue really for Brazil, and you know what right do other countries have to tell us what to do? You were talking, I think, there about persuasion, Meg.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say to this tweeter, why doesn't he care about this issue? What more can we do to persuade him that this is an issue for him and for Brazil? I mean, this deforestation, it will impact Brazil. We've already seen some 80% of Brazil suffer from droughts that are directly connected to this deforestation, and climate change is going to impact them as well. Why are we not talking more about what it means to Brazil to fight this issue and enabling more activists in their country? And that will, of course, reverberate in the leaders that they elect and influence their president as well.
And I think the other key issue is to look at the reason why this is happening, and that is for the beef industry and soy production for the cattle, and that is an international agribusiness. So it is, in terms of why this is happening, where the profit is, it does come back to a global trade, and then within that, it's the companies who are responsible for purchasing those products that are a result of the slash and burn policy that is being encouraged actively at the moment in Brazil. So it's about having legislation that's enforced in the country, but also stopping the demand for the products that are profiting from this activity that is so harmful.
I mean, you're bringing in the fact, of course, that there are layers and layers here, and we're
Yes.
all somehow responsible or culpable. To Washington again, and Shweta Chakraborty, your thoughts about this. It's not merely about politics, it's not merely about political leaders.
No, it's not. And there's several stakeholders that are involved in this and have a vested interest in ensuring that these land systems are protected as much as they can be for the overall benefit of the global citizenry. Now, we see this as the groundswell of supporters have come out in hordes, the largest protest in history, environmental protest in history, which we saw last week on Friday. And then we saw the support for the UN Climate Action Summit that was held this past Monday. And so it's not just to say this is a private sector interest or there's some political expediency here, but this is something that is really obviously on the minds of global citizens and especially younger generations. And so that's something to really keep in mind. If we're thinking about just economic versus political interests, we're really leaving out a massive constituency that has a vested interest in its future.
So, Shweta, what do you think is the best way to exert pressure or to persuade?
So I think what we're seeing is representation of interests that are really resonating within some countries, and those are the types of representations that can be scaled across new countries. So Germany is investing $60 billion in climate policy, aligned to the Secretary General of the UN's call for increased actual implementation and strategy to get to net neutral carbon emissions by 2050. We're seeing the same thing in New Zealand. It's already a renewable energy portfolio that's 80%. And that's incredible. And aggressive policies in the US, if they are able to be implemented, will also be able to get to 80% renewable energy by 2050. So these are the types of solutions that I think need to be scaled and continue to be supported by different citizens across nation states, and that will put pressure on governance to actually change and to become more aligned with the global will.
Back to the studio, thinking about incentives and solutions, what can be offered?
I don't think it's so much about putting pressure. I think it's about helping to realise the huge opportunities from clean growth. I mean, in the UK, we've seen the low carbon economy is growing at 2 to 3 times the rate of the mainstream economy. There's some 400,000 jobs involved. We have some of we're the best in offshore wind in the entire world, and there are so many jobs and opportunities involved with that. And also, as it's coming in, even last week, it defied all expectations to be the lowest source of electricity generation in terms of cost. This is going to bring down consumer bills eventually. I mean, it's about the huge opportunity that also comes from tackling climate change.
There is a difficulty, though, isn't there, in saying jam tomorrow? As in,
Yes.
there are these
specifically
these
for deforestation, because what we have in Indonesia as well with the haze, the fires there for soy, is that, and palm oil, is that there is lots of work have been going on for decades to halt deforestation and to protect our natural resources that are in the forest. The UN has a project called the RED Project, and there's lots of ways we can monetarise the value that's currently standing in that rainforest and respect the people who already live there. Because when you talk about the sovereignty, as Bolsonaro was about the Amazon, there are, of course, indigenous communities there whose voices are being quashed at the moment quite harshly in Brazil and other parts of the world. So it's also about protecting them and having their rights enforced.
Just want to bring in another strong voice here, because, of course, Mr. Bolsonaro told the UN General Assembly he was especially grateful to Donald Trump for his support. Reminding you, this is what the US President said in his speech to the UN.
Wise leaders always put the good of their own people and their own country first. The future does not belong to globalists. The future belongs to patriots. The future belongs to sovereign and independent nations who protect their citizens, respect their neighbors, and honor the differences that make each country special and unique.
For many, that's a pretty powerful argument.
So what he was saying was that the future lies with. And yesterday we had the UN report on ocean sea level rise come out that basically said in 80 years we'll have up to a 1.1 metre sea level rise, affecting nearly every single coastal city around the world. The future is already changing beyond anything most of us can imagine. And that is why the environment has to be at the top of the agenda of pretty much everything we do going forward to address this issue, because the future is changing beyond anything we recognise.
Again, I think as much I fully accept the science, and it is absolutely vital that we deal with this urgently, because if we're going to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, we must act now. But there are also so many opportunities from America. The solar industry in America is growing so quickly, and it has more jobs in it right now than coal. And this is an industry which is growing so vastly that eventually coal, we're already phasing it out in the UK. It's an old technology. It's an old way of generating energy. It's part of the past. And Donald Trump is going to find himself on the wrong side of history if he doesn't start to accept that huge economic opportunities that come, not just the downsides from not tackling climate change, but the huge opportunities from acting now to address it.
Let me just bring in some more tweets, because people are very interested and invested in this debate. Just a few examples for you coming up now on our Twitter feed. From Germany, for example, we've heard from Arnella de Noir. She says, as a forest engineer, I can tell you that forest belongs to country on which the territory lies on, and this means it's their right to maintain it. Another tweet says, it belongs to us all. It's all connected and we depend on it. And then there's this tweet from Chile. Amazon belongs to Brazil, most of the Amazon, like coal to India, USA, UK, China, like oil to the Middle East. But if everyone decides to burn them, it affects us all. It'll be a collective suicide. Shweta, I want to come back to you in Washington. That phrase, it'll be a collective suicide. Yes, we hear that. But then you do have politicians running campaigns and speaking to constituencies. How do you get the message through to people who aren't already tuned in? How do you go beyond preaching to the choir?
Right, and that is the question, and that is what I work on as a risk and behavioral scientist, how to communicate effectively so as to encourage behavioral outcomes that are aligned to benefit of the individual and to society writ large. And so that is the challenge. And ultimately, that is what I'm going to be watching closely in these political campaigns, to see how you see some of these individuals who have a stake in the future of the American constituency, for example, for the upcoming elections for the next president, to see how they are able to break through the echo chambers and to really bring in those who might not necessarily be part of the conversation, but that are critical. We're already seeing climate change as obviously part of the liberal agenda, but increasingly joining into the conservative agenda as well. This is because younger generations are much more aware of what was just described as this collective suicide, worst case scenario that could be happening within this the end of this century. And so because of that heightened awareness, there is going to need to be messaging that really cuts across these different political agendas. And so that is something that if behavioral science is actively applied into these campaigns, we'll be successful in doing. I really am encouraged in seeing the numbers of young voters in the right end of the spectrum who are increasingly interested in climate issues.
And let's bring in one of them. Let's bring in Meg from the Conservative Environmental Network. If you are to bring more voters from the right on board, I know one of the things you're concerned about is that it shouldn't all be couched in terms of state intervention or huge state spending. There is a different way to approach it.
Absolutely, and I think she's absolutely right that we need to make sure that we engage people from across the political spectrum. In the UK, we've been extremely lucky with the amount of consensus we've got in climate change, the amount of conservative leadership that we've had on climate change, and I think that's going to be vital as we move towards net zero. We need to have everyone on board with this. We're going to be asking the public to have huge changes in their daily lives. And we need to make sure that not a single person is left behind or alienated from that discussion.
And just a very brief final thought from you, Angela.
Yeah, so there are no lines in the sky. What we know is that the impacts are here and they will be getting worse. But the benefits of action are huge, and that's what we should be putting all our attention onto, is those renewable jobs and protecting our biodiversity.
Well, Angela, Meg and Shetta in Washington, thank you very much. I think we have some more news to bring you as well, some breaking news which has just come out of Washington, where the most senior US intelligence official is due to speak publicly for the first time about concerns raised by a whistleblower, concerns that prompted an impeachment inquiry against President Trump. Joseph Maguire is expected to be asked to explain why he withheld for weeks concerns raised by an intelligence official about a phone conversation between Mr. Trump and the Ukrainian president. Now, just coming in now, we're hearing from the Reuters news agency that the US intelligence panel has released, this is just coming through to me now actually, let me bring this up on the computer, the whistleblower's complaint. Now, we were expecting this. You remember we spoke to Gary O'Donoghue in Washington about this. We have had some of the data, we've had some extracts from the phone conversation. Apparently, the whistleblower complaint has now been released in full, which means, in short, we've got a lot more to go on in trying to explain to you what on earth is going on in Washington, in Congress, about impeachment and all the connections with Ukraine. So I just wanted to tell you that because we know that a lot of people are watching and looking at the BBC online and want to know the latest on this story. Sorry for interrupting you, because we do now actually have more time to pick up on this, because one of the points that was made by those who've been tweeting back and forth today was, well, if you start with the expropriation of part of the Amazon, tell Brazil it can't do what it wants with the Amazon, where do you stop? What about oil? What about gas? What about holy sites? You know, what about the treatment of the Great Barrier Reef in Australia? I mean, Angela, I see the point that is being made here, which is this is quite a precedent to set if you say this is not Brazil's problem alone.
I think what we're seeing is we've got globally about 100 companies that are responsible for the majority of the greenhouse gas emissions, and they are moving too slowly to clean up their acts, and especially the fossil fuel industry, which someone mentioned. So there are all sorts of ways of putting pressure on them to accelerate. Every country has signed up to the Paris Agreement, including Brazil, which says we want to keep temperatures as below 2 degrees as possible. We're currently on track for almost 4 degrees Celsius of temperature rise, which means we have to at least triple the amount of climate action we're doing. And that will only happen if something drastically changes over the next few years. Currently, with non-legal agreements, it's not happening. That's what we know for sure. So it's either got to happen through legislation or consumer demand or potentially personal prosecutions of those who are the most responsible, like has happened with the air pollution scandal that VW and other car firms have been involved in.
I mean, I've been talking about persuasion and co-opting people quite a lot, but there is the issue of sanctions and punishments. And Shetta, I want to bring you back in on this, Shetta Chakraborty in Washington, because there is this concept of ecocide, you know, an international crime and perhaps a charge that could be levied against leaders who fail to stop severe environmental damage. Is that something, that idea of ecocide, Shetta, that you think is necessary?
Yeah, and that's actually a concept I mentioned when we first started this conversation as a very real final outcome for the worst perpetrators in the climate crisis, like Bolsonaro, like Trump. And so the concept of outlawing ecocide by those in global governance was first put forward in 1972, and it was considered radical environmentalism. But now, as what we used to consider radical environmentalism is becoming more mainstream, as we're seeing in the millions of supporters who came out and supported this agenda leading up to the UN Climate Action Summit, we're slowly reaching that tipping point where this could become a really real alleged accusation to be made against some of these leaders who are not doing their job as stewards of the environment in their positions. And so that is something we could see coming to the forefront the same way leaders have been held accountable for genocide. We are still affecting hundreds of thousands of indigenous people in the Amazon, for example, by some of these policies that Bolsonaro is putting forward. Is he going to be held accountable for that? I strongly believe he should be.
I mean, as an environmentalist, I'm obviously, when you see the pictures of the Amazon burning, you just feel angry. And there's something very emotive about, ecocide, but I think it's just a very extreme measure to take, and it's a very dangerous precedent to set if you have an international community trying to impose this will on a democratically elected president and trying to force this agenda. What really should be happening is this more bottom-up approach. I mean, we saw in Copenhagen in 2009 what can happen when we try to enforce these rules on countries, and actually 6 years later in Paris, that was when everything started to really come together.
So you think it's possibly counterproductive, Meg?
I think it can be, really, and that's what we saw at the UN in his speech. Really what needs to happen is we need to grow that base of support in Brazil. We need to show him that there are different routes. Some of the routes that are taken by environmentalists, some of the most mainstream ones, for example, Brazil has recently had so many negative feelings towards socialism, and all of these policies that start to direct to greater government intervention, greater government spending, that doesn't necessarily have to be the only way to address climate change. And sometimes the left can feed into that by saying that that's the only way, and if you don't agree with that, then you're a climate denier. And I think that can alienate more conservatives from the discussion.
I think as a scientist, all you really need to look at is whether our emissions are drastically being cut, which is what we've all agreed need to happen, or they're increasing, which is currently where we're at. So there is a huge failure in the current system we have of voluntary agreements to tackle the most important issue ever that's faced the world, because it's irreversible, the change, the damage that we're doing at the moment. So if we keep carrying on as we are, hoping emissions will go down, they're not.
But if you're talking about drastic action, I appreciate, Angela, you're talking as a climate scientist
Yes.
here. But if you believe it's an emergency, do you think there need to be more drastic sanctions available? Hence this idea of, say, an ecocide charge.
There has to be some change because what we're doing currently isn't working. There are various routes that could go down. There is fiduciary duty on directors already, i.e. if they're doing something that's irresponsible to their shareholders, that's something people are exploring at the moment. And for example, New York State is currently trying to sue some of the fossil fuel companies because they've been knowingly lobbying against climate change measures. So there are civil courts happening, there are potentials for individual directors to be looked at. But what we definitely know is that emissions keep going up and they have to be drastically reduced, and we have the technologies to do it. So the incumbents have too much of a foothold at the moment to keep business as usual going.
I'm going to pick up on your thought that we have the technology to do it. You have all brought solutions
Yes.
and actions into this discussion.
This is the most frustrating part of it.
This is frustrating because action is there and is available.
Action is there and available, and the thing is, it's got so many benefits in terms of jobs, in terms of saving money. So we could harvest the wind. We're an island country here in the UK, and not be importing fossil fuels, creating green jobs, cleaning up our air so we don't have 14% of our children with asthma, and then also reducing greenhouse gases.
We have to leave it there because there's a lot of news coming in from Washington. But Angela, Meg and Shweta joining us from Washington, thank you all very much. Appreciate your expertise, your insights and your passion on this crucial issue. Thank you.